Hello, everybody that I can't see out in webinar land. I'm Heather Topcik, Director of Research Collections at Bard Graduate Center, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our first ever BGC Library Artists in Residence virtual opening. I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. Bard Graduate Center respectfully acknowledges our presence in the Lenape-Hawking, the ancestral homeland of the Lenni Lenape, and recognizes New York City as a past, present, and future crossroads for many Indigenous people. In addition, we would like to acknowledge those whose ancestors did not arrive on these lands of their own free will, and whose tremendous cultural, economic, and technological contributions continue to provide the foundation for our lives. Before we get started, I'd like to point out some webinar housekeeping details. This webinar has closed captioning provided by Rev. If you'd like to enable closed captioning on your screen, you can do so by clicking on the CC icon in the lower right-hand toolbar. You're welcome to submit any questions through the Q&A function, and we will answer them toward the end of the presentation. And we are reserving the chat function for expressions of appreciation and gratitude. So feel free to express your enthusiasm through chat. You can throw your name in there and say hello and where you're from, and we'd love to see that. I hope you all found yourself a plate of cheese and crackers and a beverage of your choice as we step into the third annual Bard Graduate Center Library Artists in Residence exhibition. So we put together this slideshow in hopes that we can virtually simulate the experience of walking into the building and through the gallery as you enjoy the installations. I'd like to share some background to the BGC Library's Artists in Residence program. Now in its third year, the program was developed as part of a wider institutional effort to bring artists in conversation with our gallery exhibition and other institutional initiatives. The specific objective of the Library AIR program, as we call it, is to invite visual or performance artists whose work is grounded in research to use our collections as an incubator for new explorations. Artists are invited to conduct research in subject areas relevant to their practice or to address the library itself as a concept, an institution, or simply an organized collection of material and information, utilizing the library's reference staff as partners in the process. The resulting collaboration creates a unique opportunity for both artists and librarians while highlighting the distinctive aspects of our research library and expanding Bard Graduate Center's relevance to a new audience. This year had its unique challenges. We just welcomed Harley and Jenny, our artists, to BGC in person in February of 2020 to begin their residency when the pandemic was a disconcerting news story. In March of that year, along with the rest of the world, BGC closed its doors and went virtual for the remainder of the academic year, and the residency was put on hold. Though nearly all of our programs were remote for the 2021 academic year, we were able to keep the library open to students and faculty and our artists in a safely distanced way. Although Jenny and Harley were not able to enjoy the bustling social and intellectual atmosphere that was characteristic of BGC in non-pandemic times, they did have plenty of quality time with the collection itself, often alone in the stacks. Each was able to give a mid-year Zoom presentation of their works in progress. Some of you may have attended those presentations, which are recorded and available on our website. Our excellent public programs and communications team, Nadia Rivers and Maggie Walters, also produce virtual studio visits with each artist via Instagram Live. And a new development this year was the publication of a catalog to accompany the exhibition. We are trying our best to make sure the first 100 of you who signed up for print catalogs get one. Rest assured the PDF version will be shared with everyone and will be available on our website. If you signed up on Eventbrite but didn't have the chance to input your mailing address, you can do so now through the Google form posted in the chat. I'm going to give you a few minutes to do that, or a few seconds to do that if you want to input your information. Now, I'm delighted to introduce this year's resident artists, Harley Nigrico and Jenny Tobias. Harley Nigrico is a Chinese-American lens-based artist born and raised in State College, Pennsylvania. She earned a BFA from Cooper Union School of Art in 2013. Harley has participated in residencies at Trestle Art Space and the Vermont Studio Center and Tiny Birch AIR. She was funded by the Wingate Foundation to attend workshops at Urban Glass and the Penland School of Crafts, in addition to completing the AIM Fellowship at the Bronx Museum in 2019. She is included in the upcoming 2021 International Photography Annual, published through Manifest Press. Currently, she is a photography technician at the Cooper Union School of Art and is based in Brooklyn, New York. Jennifer Tobias is a scholar and illustrator. She holds a PhD in art history from the City University of New York, an MLS from Rutgers, and a BFA from Cooper Union. She has provided reader services at the Museum of Modern Art and Parsons School of Design libraries. Her illustrations are included in Health Design Thinking and Design is Storytelling, both by Ellen Lupton. She and Lupton are currently developing Extra Bold, a feminist, inclusive, subversive, non-binary field guide for graphic design, published just last week from Princeton Architectural Press. Jenny and Harley will now take you through their exhibition and focus on some select pieces. And we will begin with Harley.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Heather. And thank you so much for this past year at the library. It's been truly fantastic. Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming and being here. My exhibition is called Imagining the Artifact, Collaging Blue and White Chinese Pottery. So you can see here, my show ended up being two separate projects. My first series, if you go to the next slide, you will see is a installation in one of the bookshelves in the wall here. It is 12 cyanotypes that are around 11 by 14, and they are called Reconfigure. I'm gonna walk you through how I made some of these and some of the images that I actually used to collage all of these. If you go to the next slide, you'll see a book that I used called The Grammar of Chinese Ornament by Owen Jones. And this particular book, it's very hard to find in print. It was printed in 1866, so quite a while ago. And Owen Jones was a designer, and he actually collected a lot of designs from all over the Eastern world and basically made this design history available to the Western world. And in doing so, all of these catalogs have hundreds of plates of all of these flat designs. And since this book was published in 1866, it's actually much later than some of the speculative origins of blue and white Chinese porcelain, which is what my show is focusing on. If you go to the next slide, you shall see one of the example plates. So you can see it's a bunch of different colors, but I wanted to show you my process a little bit because you can identify some of the pattern pieces and some of the cut up pieces here. I did a process where I was scanning a bunch of books and I was turning them into digital negatives, and I was literally cutting them up. If you move on to the next slide, you can see details of all of the other images. And I was really just playing around with cutting up a bunch of these, putting in my own landscape images. So I was doing one plate and one image per print. They actually are unique prints for each one because since there's about 30 to 40 pieces in each print, it's only printable in one go. So there's no way that I could actually rearrange these all in the same order again. So in doing this, it's been really interesting for me to think about what it means to return a lot of these designs in Owen Jones's book kind of back to this palette of blue and white, especially because a lot of that pottery started in the 1300s, so a lot earlier than from when this book was published. And oh, if you go back, thank you. With this series, I'm thinking a lot about photographic flatness. And if you guys don't know that much about cyanotype, it's actually this process that was invented to kind of easily reproduce images, especially of the natural world. And it's kind of this kind of quick, fast blueprint and a way to archive information in this way. And I was really interested in seeing how I could actually make these images feel like scans of shards of porcelain. So it almost looks like that these are on a scanner bed, you know, being arranged in different configurations in this way. I definitely work very, I gather images and then I kind of play with them and arrange them. So these are the results of a lot of these different experiments. And it was nice to be able to install it in the library in this way because it was nice to actually see everything in a grid together. So you can compare everything nice and easily. I'm thinking a lot about archaeological imagination also with abstraction in photography in this way. And also thinking about photographic gaze, and especially landscape gaze, and what it means for objects to kind of hold that gaze. If we go forward to the second project, this project is called Remnants. And this one is connected to the first one, although it is very different in execution. This is actually a 6-foot-long installation. It is about a foot tall and made of about 7 different pieces. So when you see the details here, there's a piece on the left and a zoomed in detail on the right. So you can really kind of get your eyes in there and take a look. These are kind of crazy looking. I spent the past year developing this kind of method of stained glass soldering, image transferring, both with photographic digital film and with graphite drawings on ceramic tile. You can see each image has pieces of glass that have designs transferred on them, a photographic image, and then also the white pieces are the graphite drawings, and everything is fixed with resin. Both of the designs for the graphite drawings and the glass pieces are drawn from a museum in Istanbul called the Topcik collection. This collection that I was researching turned out to be extremely special. It has over 10,000 pieces of blue and white Chinese porcelain from the Yan, Ming, and Qing dynasties, which is from the 1300s to the early 1900s. So a very long and important span of time for Chinese export porcelain history. And I'm definitely playing around with all of the designs that I've found. There's a lot of floral scrolls, there's a lot of animals, there's a lot of seals, there's a lot of different line work in different ways in this as well. And the actual method that I used was a stained glass method to put everything together. It's called the copper foil stained glass method. And literally all the black lines that you see is where solder is holding everything together. And there's also some spaces in between and some gaps and everything as I was organically putting everything together. Kind of like the Cyanotype series, I gave myself 3 parameters with 1 image, a set of designs, and 1 drawing to transfer to these surfaces, cut apart, and then rearrange. So this is also a similar exploration with shape and joining and kind of a meditation on porcelain through the lens of black and white photography and archiving also, and what it means to reproduce these images, and thinking about both of those histories in that way. If we continue on to the next slide, I can talk about a specific one. Let's see, yes, piece number 4. And if we go to the next slide, I decided to show you a in-progress piece of glass. So this is an example of one of the designs that I have transferred onto a full sheet of glass. All these pieces have been cut and sanded, and there is foil all around these. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see one of the drawings here. The drawing on the left is actually, it's a qilin. It's a Chinese unicorn in a sense. It's a horse body that has a dragon head, deer antlers, fish scale body, ox hooves, and a lion tail. So very fantastic and very fun to draw also. But this was the drawing stage of the ceramic pieces without any of the foil on it. So you can just see how that looks. And on the right is one of the photography pieces with the image transferred and with the copper foil on the actual piece here. And this is what everything looks like before it kind of gets mushed all together. If you go to the next slide. I wanted to talk about one more book that was very important to me at BGC with the time that I spent here. And this book is called The 8 Brokens. It's about Chinese Bapo painting. And I had no idea about this practice of Chinese folk painting at all. Basically, it started also around the Yan Dynasty, so a similar time to when blue and white porcelain production was starting. But it was considered a lower art form, not like a true high painting in Chinese society. A lot of artists did these on the side, just as kind of exercises and meditation on Chinese culture. And basically the renderings of calligraphy, ancient poems, different of coins. So literally these artists would be collecting all these scraps of writing and things that were important to them or things that they found beautiful. And then they would make these photorealistic renditions of them. And a lot of times they turn into these like kind of wild compositions. And also this way of trying to imagine the past, but also acknowledge that it can never be the same again. So this book was very influential with how I was creating both my Cyanotype series, Reconfigure, and the new photo sculptural series with Remnants. And just keeping that in mind, I had a really great time scanning and researching these in the library. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see both of the final series end result. So I'm very excited about this installation, and I'm very happy with how it turned out and how it looks. So I'm very happy I got to share this with you. Thank you so much. And I'm going to hand off the screen to Jenny now. So take it away, Jenny.
Hey everybody, thanks Harley, and thank you to everyone for coming. I want to talk a little bit about my project, and if you're in the library and you imagine going down the steps exactly one floor, so the next slide you'll see my installation. It's called Working with the Hands, Applied Arts Training in New York City, 1800 to 2020. And as you can see in the next slide, I used the grid of 12 shelves and investigated 12 specific New York City schools where you could learn specific practices. And it starts in 1820 with a school where you could learn penmanship and writing. And it ends in 2020 with a social practice school. There were other practices like stained glass, basketry, metalwork, and printing that are each examined in those little cubbies. So what I want to do now is, if you go to the next slide, focus on this specific work over here on the left. And then if you go to the next slide, we'll zoom in and take a look at this object and a drawing that represents the Howard Orphanage and Industrial School. And this was an orphanage and industrial school located first in Weeksville, Brooklyn, starting in the 1860s. And then in 1911, it moved to Kings Park, Long Island. And it was quite an interesting place, quite well documented. And one of the most astonishing things, amazing things about it is that it was completely self-directed by African Americans. It was directed, funded, built. The teachers were African Americans. And the school in particular was modeled on the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. You could learn things like chair caning, sewing, cooking, and shoe repair in different times over the years. And what I focused on was the skill of carpentry that they taught there. So I made this thing, which you can see in a frontal view here. And I'm going to talk about 4 components that went into the piece. So if you go to the next slide, there's first the overall structure, which is the brown lattice. And that's a scale model of an étagère or a bookshelf. Then you'll see on the shelf, there's these stacks of books, which are made out of wood. And then you'll see these Monopoly houses, 28 of them, in fact. And the whole thing is built on, literally and figuratively, a copy of Working with the Hands, part of Booker T. Washington's memoir, published in 1904. So let's first take a look at the étagère part. It's based on a photograph from the Library of Congress that is beautifully documents the institution when it was in Kings Park, Long Island. So you'll see here on the left, it's a bit in shadow, but here's this object, and you can see how it illustrates the students learning how to do carpentry. So I got very interested in the object, and to kind of, suss it out a little bit, first I drew it in perspective. And then I drew it again to try and discover its rhythms and its modularity. And it turns out it is quite modular. It's a 12 square grid, sort of like the bookshelves. And the rhythm and the pacing of the vertical elements is actually quite beautiful. And that was something I really would have learned only by really getting into it like that. And through that process, I was also trying to make it buildable. So if you go to the next slide, after a lot of very amateur woodwork, I put together this thing, which is this scale model. So then if you go back to the photograph of the object, you'll notice, next slide, that there's these stacks of books. And these are also little teeny mini-me books, and they're made out of wood. And my thinking there was that you can learn about carpentry through books and manuals. And boy, did I learn a lot about it through these wonderful turn of the century manuals in the Bard Graduate Center collection. But it occurred to me that if you were a carpentry student, such as at the Howard Institution, your real, books are made out of wood, but that for a carpentry student, the real textbook is the wood itself, working with the hands, with the wood. So it seemed appropriate to me that for a carpenter, if they had books on their shelves, they would be the wood itself. So that was the thinking there. So you'll notice next to those stacks, there's these Monopoly pieces. You're probably familiar with that real estate strategy game, great emblem of capitalism in our time. It was first marketed in the 1930s. And you probably remember those little hotels. In my childhood, they were made out of plastic. And in the first editions of Monopoly, they were actually made out of wood and painted red and green. So also in the 1930s, these represent sort of the houses, the building of Weeksville, the building of New York City that these students were participating in. But it also represents a more onerous practice that, like monopoly, was introduced in the 1930s. And it was a practice called redlining. So if you go to the next slide, this was, you may be familiar with this, in the 1930s, home loan bankers basically mapped out many United States cities and effectively determined who could get loans to build or mortgage their houses. And this was a very effective and unfortunately very long-lasting tool of racial segregation. So this map is from an amazing project called Mapping Inequality, where they've scanned, digitized, and GPSified all of these maps, and you can really drill down in incredible and very appalling detail on this practice. So if you go to the next slide, we can zoom in a little bit on Weeksville. If you're more familiar with Brooklyn, you may know this intersection where that yellow dot is. It's the intersection of Troy Street and Dean Avenue. And see, it's just south of Fulton and Atlantic. And then if you go to the next slide, we can actually see what the building looked like, courtesy of the Brooklyn Public Library. This was a purpose-built building, again, designed, funded, and populated by African Americans, that was specifically made to house, to be housing for the orphans, but then also to be this industrial school. So that's kind of where the monopoly pieces come from. And then if you go to the next slide, the number of monopoly pieces I decided to make significant, because along the way I learned about an amazing publication called The Negro Artisan, published in 1902. It was co-authored by W.E.B. Du Bois, the educational reformer and advocate, and he worked with another author and an amazing team from Atlanta University. And it turns out it's this amazing, very rich quantitative and qualitative study of Negro skilled or African-American skilled tradespeople in right around 1890, turn of the century, when of course the orphanage school was operating. And one of the data gathering was so amazing that if you go deep onto page 135 and you read, down the charts, you can learn, as I did, that there were exactly, according to this, survey, 28 African-American carpenters in New York City in 1890. And something about that quantity was just so, like that was a room of people that I might meet. And in my imagination, that at least maybe one or two of those carpenters had learned their trade at the school. So if you go to the next slide. And just returning to the object, I'll conclude with the final piece, the principle on which the work and really the whole show rests. It's a copy of, next slide, the part 2 of the memoir of Booker T. Washington called Working with the Hands. And it was published also around the same time as the Negro Artisan was published in 1904. And as you may know, Booker T. Washington was the profound leader of the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama and a tireless advocate for education for African Americans. And this edition is actually quite beautiful. It wasn't printed at Tuskegee, which had a print shop, but it's very beautifully designed, and it features photographs by a photographer who also documented the Hampton Institute in Virginia, Francis Johnson. So the idea is that so this book inspired that work, but if you go to the next slide, just in conclusion, it really was formative for me for help shaping this whole idea of working with the hands in New York City over the course of 200 years. And with that, I'll turn it over to Heather.
Thank you, Jenny, and thank you, Harley, for those beautiful presentations. And the installations in the library really are gorgeous in person and on screen. The photography is beautiful. It's been such a pleasure to work with both of you this year, even if it was more distance than we had hoped. As a librarian, I'm always fascinated to see what artists unearth in our collection and how they use our materials, and find out how the resources show up in their work. You know, as working in an academic institution, so much of what we do is collaborate with faculty and students on research and synthesizing information that is then shows up in the form of writing and scholarship and publication, which is, you know, the bread and butter of what we do at BGC. And yet I think it is so rich to see how artists can take that information and kind of have you know, it's so appropriate, Jenny, like to work through it in a haptic way and create something and understand it on a level that is different than and alongside the kind of academic research that scholars do here. So we are happy to take questions from the people in the audience who I wish I could see. And I remind you that we can use the Q&A function for questions. I see a couple are starting to populate, and I will read them out. But to kick off, I do have a question of my own I'd like to ask you, because both of you trained at Cooper Union, which is coincidental. That was not by design, and you were there at different times. But you really work in different media and subject matter, and it was our intention to pair artists working on different projects for this project. For us, it was important to have more than one artist to create a kind of community around this project. And I wanted to ask you both how working in tandem and kind of parallel in the library infected your individual projects over time. So, anyone of you can start.
Harley, or?
Sure. Well, it was really exciting for me to see all of Jenny's interests in craft education, because also as someone who loves craft education, has done a lot of different techniques and courses and things. Her approach to pedagogy, I was really excited about. And also, she has helped me actually frame my practice in a little bit of a larger picture, because sometimes it's really easy for me just to like focus in so much on singular objects. So it's been nice to have Jenny, because she can like pull me back a little bit.
It was such a pleasure to work with Harley. We just, you know, after our great introduction by Heather and the staff, we just kind of set up in the reading room and launched into it. And I'd be, you know, walking around with these stacks of books and furiously going through the database and stuff like that. And Harley would be sort of calmly looking through Owen Jones and, you know, doing other things. And it was nice. It was the idea of the residency as integrating into the Bard community. Yeah, it was a little sort of quarantine. We were sort of quarantined where we were our own bubble, but it was certainly just a wonderful opportunity to really immerse in thinking with somebody else. In particular, like one very practical place we intersected is one of the practices I look at it is stained glass. And let's just say I haven't done stained glass in a while. So I'm up there with my hammer, like in my apartment, you know, throwing pieces of glass around. And Harley received several emails, you know, asking for, so how am I supposed to do this? And, you know, she turned me on to many interesting techniques and a wonderful school in Brooklyn. So I like that we could talk, you know, at the pedagogical level, but also at the nitty gritty, you know, sanding and gluing level. And then just finally, it's really wonderful to work across generations of Cooper Union graduates. You know, I was there a while ago, and it's been really nice to just chat with Harley about what the scene is like now and some of the issues that are prevailing. Also, just Cooper Union was, again, one of the practices that I look at, specifically the Women's School of Design for engraving. So it all came together really nicely.
Great. Thank you both. That's, you know, something I observed, and I'm glad that you were both able to talk about. I have a question from Alessia Valfredini. Hi, Alessia. And her question is for Harley, and it is, did manipulating the pieces and cutouts from the books change your relationship with the original material?
Oh, definitely. In a way, a lot of this project was me just trying to understand this material a lot more, because I have also grown up with a lot of these porcelain designs around me, but not necessarily like registering what it means or what they are. So it's just been nice to actually get some Eastern art history. You know, much love to Cooper, but that was a big class there. It is changing though slightly, so always a step in the right.
I took an East Asian art class when I was there, so
Oh.
they you know, they represent.
I must have missed it, but
yeah.
it was a really great way for me to actually fill in a lot of gaps, but also it was also a way for me to like feel more familiar with something by actually breaking it down, if that makes sense. Like for a lot of the catalogs to have these photo reproductions that are so far from the original, sometimes it almost felt more real if they were actually fragmented. You know, this is me talking about abstraction in my process and what feels closer to what the actual object might have been. So
you also mentioned how that they, like in Owen Jones in particular, these were usually three-dimensional objects, but for the purposes of printing, they're flattened, and that you're on the one hand respecting that flatness with the cyanotype process and the they're very flat, but also, you know, by breaking them apart and constructing them, you're also exploring their dimensionality. So that was a really interesting surprise to me.
Totally. It's like putting more body back into it, but it's still flat.
Yeah.
So I have a question here for Jenny, and it is, did you explore other crafts besides woodwork while making your exhibition? And and I know the answer to that is yes. And maybe you...
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. I stumbled through things like stone carving down there at on the lower shelf, letterpress printing, metalwork in my apartment, camouflage practices. I learned a lot about the making of prosthetics at the turn of the century. I explored the works of Friedrich Froebel and other progressive educators in their use of paper and paper weaving to make that pair of hands that you see up on towards the upper right. There was my adventures in stained glass, also lettering, and the most fun and the part I'd like to continue exploring actually was 3D printing. So using this very contemporary technique to elucidate traditional analog methods. It was so fun.
Everyone should get the catalog because it has all of Jenny's projects in it.
Yeah, I think I'll jump in here and just talk a little bit about the catalog, because that's in some of the questions here. So that was a project that Jenny had been working on as part of her artistic process, and at a few months ago during her talk, the thought was, well, why don't we produce the catalog here at BGC? And we were able to collaborate with our design team to create an actual artifact. And so the question is how to get the catalog. Each of the catalogs are going to be available via PDF, and they will be available on our website, and we can send them to those of you who have attended. So rest assured those PDFs will be coming. There is a limited print run of the catalog, and I just have a question here that says that the Google form asking to repost the Google form. Somebody didn't catch it earlier. And for the first 100 people who are sign up with their addresses, we will send a book out. Unfortunately, we couldn't produce a huge print run, but I think there'll probably be enough for everybody. And so that's the nuts and bolts of the book, but it does detail all of the work that is in the exhibition. So that's something that answers these questions.
Time for a shout out to Bard graphic designer Jocelyn Lau, who walked into quite a project she wasn't expecting and managed to make it into something printable. So thanks, Jocelyn.
Oh, it says the Google form is saying need permission. We're going to work on that on the back end for sure. And just as another quick housekeeping thing in questions about those of you who came late to the presentation, this is being recorded and there will be all of the images and the recordings related to this entire residency will be available on our website. It will take some time for this particular recording to be edited and up there, but we are documenting everything for you to refer back to. Back to content questions. A question for Harley. What did you learn about Chinese design principles while creating your pieces?
Oh man, there's a lot of stuff going on. There are actually too many books to count from different time periods. So picking one specific style is definitely a good idea. And even within that, it was really interesting to see how some different styles have changed, especially from the Yuan to the Qing period. Especially when different colors were starting to be introduced, what stayed, what didn't stay, what is like kind of iconic and stuff. There's a lot of different flowers and trees and plants that all have different meanings and are all very interesting. Like the peony always comes up, Chinese rose. There are a lot of from the early on period of this really interesting thing called cloud scrolls. And they're kind of like these kind of line depiction of clouds. So it's more of a suggestion, but they're usually used as decorative borders. I found those to be really nice. There's an infinite list of a lot of these. Definitely checking out different museums and websites where you can actually look up a lot of these is really great also. You know, I know BGC is a part of a lot of art libraries in New York. And it's really great that there's a lot of these collections that are actually available. You just have to do a little bit of digging, but you're definitely able to find these. And specifically, actually, the book that I use is cited in the catalog. If anyone's interested, it's by this guy named Mitsugi, who made a 3-volume collection on the Topcik Museum.
You were saying that the Topcik is like the kind of collection of record for early blue and white porcelain from the 13th century, was it?
Yes, definitely.
And it's in Istanbul, right? Which says a lot about.
Right. Yeah, I wouldn't. Yeah, it says a lot about a lot.
Yeah, specifically for the export porcelain, because that's even a subcategory within Chinese porcelain too. So it has been exported.
Well, that was on this. It would have been on the Silk Road, right? So that would have been kind of the highway of where it was coming and going. Yeah. See, I didn't know that stuff. They didn't cover it at micro reunion class.
Yeah. Filling in the blank.
Great. So I have a question for Jenny from Maria Sturm. Did you encounter anything in the Bard collection that you did not expect to be there?
Oh, question from a fellow library lover and historian. Thanks, Maria. Oh, you always encounter things that you're not expecting. So it was great fun to romp through the stacks and special collections. I'll give two examples. One thing I wasn't expecting was there was a lot of representation of British crafts from, from the arts and crafts period, which would make sense, but a number of wonderful manuals, like again, manuals showing, small children with very large and powerful power tools, which was interesting. But a lot of nitty gritty, but sort of more based in London. And so that sort of got me thinking like, oh, this would be so fun to do the same project in other cities. And then finally, the second thing that was really fun to romp through was Bard has a material, a study collection, which was sort of vaguely in my head, but in the first iterations before COVID hit, it was really fun I was thinking more about a display that would use representative objects from the collections, hat making, engravings, things like that. So that seemed like another really rich area where you could actually go in a cabinet and pull out this thing and exhibit it or explore it in a similar way to making new objects. So yes, every library has amazing things you don't know that you want to see.
Yeah, I mean, it's I think a testament to the things you can find out when you have extended time to spend in a place, and
access to great librarians and archivists who really know their collection well.
Well, thank you. Yes, it's we love our collection, and this is a fruitful collaboration. So I have another question for Harley from Gretel Collins, and it is, the I Ching comes to mind when I experience the randomness you suggest. Any connection?
Oh, I haven't actually directly thought about that, but I definitely try not to think very much whenever I'm actually assembling things. So maybe there is a good connection there. I kind of like to just put stuff in front of me and just kind of let my hands kind of figure it out, if that makes sense. The photo sculptural series, the Remnant series, was very technical to figure out. But once I got past the technicalities, it was really freeing actually to take all these pieces that took, months to prepare, and just kind of really play with them together in that way. But that's interesting. I'm definitely going to think about that more, and think about chance and assemblage and all this stuff.
Yeah, that could be an interesting piece to a practice to incorporate into your process. And that is an interesting question. Next question. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, I'm sure some of the artists who were doing the Bapo painting might have been thinking about it too.
Yeah, well, as a follow-up question from Sandy Fong, did the book about Chinese Bapo painting inspire your project design, or had you already decided on your project approach?
It definitely helped me just with my conceptual approach. I guess you could say that there might be like a certain shape that I've been gravitating towards, or just within the scope of the size of the print, or maybe just the size of the pieces and everything. But it definitely led me to a place where I could just explore the pieces that I had.
I have a question for Jenny from Barb Elam, which is, does the Howard Orphanage building still exist, and did you visit the site?
Got it. Barb, who manages the study collection.
Exactly.
Thanks, Barb. Unfortunately, that building does not exist. The wonderful site Brownstoner did a deep dive into it. And unfortunately, that photograph from the Brooklyn Public is the main, image of the building itself. We know who the architect was. There is evidence of, fundraising for it and events that happened to it through, also through Brooklyn Public, through the Brooklyn Eagle. I think now if you go and Google, it's kind of sad actually. I think it's like a bus depot or something like that. I have some articles about Weeksville, and some other websites have done some really nice exploration of the history of African-American community in Weeksville. So another direction for the project would be to really explore how that no longer extant building fit into the larger community.
And on a related note, another question for you, Jenny, from Sandy Fung. Do all of the schools have the same kind of interesting backstory as the Howard Orphanage?
Oh man, you really know how to ask me the right question. Well, I certainly think so. Exploring them all was just really fascinating. They all have different stories that reflect, time and place and culture, but yet all within New York City, and all having this common interest of teaching these practical skills to old and new New Yorkers. I explore them a little more in the print publications. So if you have the stamina, I hope maybe you can explore that, and on demand I can talk about them for way too long. I would also just like to say that there are so many more. Once I started looking for these schools, they're everywhere. And their buildings, the remnants, some of the schools are still going, but if not, they're obviously the products, the works that, the skills that they taught the students are very much with us today.
I'll make a plug for viewing the recording of your Works in Progress talk, because in that talk you focused specifically on the stone carving school that was associated with the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. And so the deep dive into each of those areas is really, really fun. So that will be on the website. Another question for Harley from Elena Kendall Aranda. What was behind your decision to use portrait image orientation for your cyanotypes as you were exploring ideas of landscape photography?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's really funny. I actually had tried to put them horizontally, and I'm like, something feels very off about this. And from what Jenny and I were talking about with feeling like there's more of a body, I do think portrait orientation kind of aids that. Just psychologically speaking or whatnot, because they almost felt too flat when they were in landscape mode. It's something that I'm still open to playing around with for sure. But that was the reason for keeping them all this way.
Interesting. Mm-hmm. And another question from Colin Fanning, who is a PhD student at BGC and a library colleague. And he asked if Jenny could speak briefly about the imagery on the wall opposite the shelves in her installation. And I'm glad, Colin, that you asked that question, because that's a piece of the exhibition that we haven't spent.
Well, thank you for asking. Yeah, it seemed like a little bit much, but the idea there, I was strongly encouraged by my BFF and general advisor, Ellen Lupton, who I think is here today. I was exploring different ideas to complement and reflect on these practices, and working with Ellen and thinking it through, I eventually landed on the idea of taking the theme of the hand and really enjoying making illustrations that reflected, that kind of riffed on each of the practices in some way. I think if you go a couple more in the slides, you can see them, but they're iPad drawings, and they're scaled to, there you go, they're scaled to the shelves, and they go in the same order. So like on the top left, that was a school, the African-American Free School, and it taught literacy through penmanship and embroidery. So I tried to make an illustration that looked like it was made with a pen. And then the next one over is represents a school for drafting, engraving, carpentry there on the next level, and so on. So it was just really fun to take some afternoons with my iPad and just really kind of invent these objects and then print them out.
Great, thanks, Jenny. And another follow-up question from Colin for Harley, and it is, would there be other types or collections of ornament from other cultural, historical, or material contexts for which you'd be interested in carrying out a similar kind of exploration?
Ooh, I think the short answer is yes, but I guess the other short answer is I'm not quite sure. I feel like I'm still processing all of this. I definitely think I'm going to be taking this kind of method going forward. I am really interested in like the life of decorative objects and how they kind of play in people's psychic lives. I was taking this one from my own experience, but yes, I would love to explore some other design histories. I can let you know later what that will be.
May I mention, if it's okay to mention here, Harley, that your parents had a shop with not the same object, but similar objects. So like you were immersed in porcelain, but also other kinds of decorative arts objects. Is that correct?
Yeah, almost.
Almost. Okay, please correct.
Oh yes, yes. My grandparents had kind of like a Chinese tchotchke kind of porcelain gift shop and stuff, along with a laundromat that they had. I was never actually in said shop, but I used to play in their basement, which had all of the stock with the stuff after they retired because they never got rid of it. God, or else I wouldn't have been so inspired. So I guess, yeah, literally the leftovers from
well, the scrappiness, the assemblage of history and stuff. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that.
Exactly. So it's kind of family archive-y kind of stuff too.
Okay. Well, sorry, my cat leads into my kind of closing question for each of you, which is what do you see next for these projects? Because both of them feel like they're at their beginnings and they have a lot of possibilities moving forward.
Well, in my case, I'd really love to sort of take it on the road, and like the London-based books in the library really make me think that, you know, every city, every town, or every city around the globe has these training programs, because that's where, you know, that's where the market is, that's where the schools are, and the both the patrons and the students. So in my dreams, it would be really fun to go to London or to Bangkok or to Topcik for that matter, and kind of do the same analysis of schools in those different cities.
I do think this is an extension of the last question a little bit for me, but I definitely, well, it's funny, I still have a lot of pieces too from this actually, so I think I'm just gonna have to make them. But I am definitely going to cycle this forward, maybe do some more straight photography methods with this as well. I'm definitely gonna be experimenting a lot this summer, so stay tuned.
Yeah, and I just want to point out my colleague Sebastian put the links to each of your talks into the chat. So if people want to just directly link from there, that is there. And I want to thank both of you again for sharing your work and for this experience. And also I want to thank the BGC library staff who worked with both of you this past year. Anna Helgeson, our reader services librarian, Chantal Sulkow, our acquisitions librarian, Sebastian Moya, technical services librarian, and Barb Elam, our study collection manager. And I also want to express gratitude to public programs team, Emily Riley, Nadia Rivers, and Maggie Walters for helping facilitate all of these virtual events related to this residency. It was a learning curve for all of us, and I'm really gratified with how well we were able to make this residency work and share all of the things that were going on with a wide audience. I also want to thank Alex Grun and Larry Mantello for installing the exhibition physically in the library. That was a really fun day and they did an incredible job. And to the facility staff at BGC for preparing the space. And And a big shout out to Jocelyn Lau for designing the beautiful catalogs, both in PDF and print form. And to all of you who've spent the last hour virtually walking through the exhibition with us and asking such wonderful questions. It's nice to feel a community around art and the library, even in a distanced way. And we really hope that you will join us for upcoming events at BGC. We do a lot of things virtually, and you could join us on June 17th at 6 p.m. for a program curated by Chinatown Art Brigade, collectively imagining degentrified and abolitionist futures. And you can see the so that you can see it on screen here, and there will be a link in the chat if you'd like to register. And you can learn about all of our upcoming events on the events page of our website. There's quite a bit there. And in fact, many of the events that we've had this past year have been recorded for posterity, and people can go back to and watch, which something I really think is wonderful. And again, thanks to all of you for joining us tonight, and hope to see you at the next BGC event online or in person. Thanks.